move on to our first speaker. I'm handing over now to our DHS ambassador, Alex Bannister, with whom it's been a joy trying to pull together the richness of presentations that we were lucky to have submitted to us. Initially, the project that Alex proposed was celebrating Women's History Month, and we have sort of reframed that to include this analysis of gender in a much wider spectrum, and to think about how that operates in professional circumstances, pedagogic circumstances, as well in the project of design historical writing and analysis. So over to Alex to introduce our delightfully rich array of speakers tonight.
Thank you so much, Claire. A warm welcome everyone to this evening's Hidden History seminar. The format of this evening's seminar is each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes. And then once all the speakers have given their papers, this will be followed by a group Q&A discussion afterwards. So if you have any questions or comments, just pop them in the chat box and these will be answered at the end of the evening. I also interviewed a couple of our speakers tonight for the Design History Society blog. So if you'd like to know anything more about their research, this can be found on our website. Our first speakers are Erica Robles-Anderson, Associate Professor of Media, Culture and Communication at NYU, and Scott Ferguson, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Humanities and Cultural Studies of the University of South Florida. And Erica and Scott will be discussing Eleanor Gibson and the origins of affordance. We'll hand over to you now, Erica and Scott.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to go first and then hand it off to Erica sort of midway. I will say that Erica and I have been thinking together for maybe about a year, and this is our kind of first foray into the public with this particular project. So we're really excited to present what we're finding and hopefully get your feedback on where we're going. So I will begin. In a 2003 TED Talk titled 3 Ways Design Makes You Happy, Donald Norman announced that the new me is beauty. Norman, a professor, design firm principal, and the first vice president of user experience at Apple, ranks among the most influential figures in the field of user experience design. But he is above all associated with the concept of affordance. Norman brokered the term from psychology to design in his 1988 book, The Psychology of Everyday Life. Citing J.J. Gibson's 1979 book, The Ecological Theory of Perception, as his source, he offered this definition. The affordances of the environment are what it offers the animal, what it provides or furnishes. In the 1980s, the medium of computing was taking form as a mass personal technology. Norman was part of a movement to constrain the material and semantic scope of personal computing through psychological principles of use. At the turn of a new millennium, in the aftershock of the tech bubble burst, Norman was thinking about what feelings afford. He dramatized this thought process on stage, and I'm going to quote his sort of free form thinking that he's doing in this TED Talk. I really had the feeling that pleasant things work better. And that never made any sense to me until I finally figured out, look, I'm going to put a plank on the ground. So imagine I have a plank about 2 feet wide and 30 feet long, and I'm going to walk on it. And you can see I can walk on it without looking. I can go back and forth. I can jump up and down, no problem. Now, I'm going to put the plank 300 feet up in the air. And now I'm not going to go near it. Thank you. Intense fear paralyzes you. It actually affects the way the brain works. That's what fear and anxiety does. It causes you to be what's called depth-first processing, to focus, not to be distracted. And I couldn't force myself across that. Now, some people can, circus workers, steel workers, but it really changes the way you think, end quote. For Norman here, the pleasure of well-designed things has something to do with anxiety. In 2003, unease would have been a salient emotion. Waging a so-called war on terror, the United States was just pulling out of a recession, and a plank across an abyss that affords safe passage to the skillful and daring could be an allegory for neoliberal precarity. But Norman's demonstration also surfaces a different moment and a hidden history underlying affordance itself, Dr. Eleanor Gibson's visual cliff. To the best of our knowledge, there are no citations of Eleanor Gibson's work in design literature. In our brief today, we correct that omission. Eleanor played a foundational role in developing a paradigm that came to shape how we perceive aesthetic, technological, and political economic possibilities. We are currently writing a critical history of affordance. In doing so, we eschew additive models of gender history with their fatal deferrals to someday, or also, or her, or they too. These logics reproduce a model of inclusion as perpetual supplementarity because they imagine the project of history as an asymptotic climb toward completeness. Gibson's visual cliff was always already a story of affordance. Our task is to offer a critical history of its world-shifting gestalt. Next slide, please. In April 1960, Eleanor Gibson and Richard Walk astonished Scientific American readers with photographs featuring a baby boy crawling atop a sheet of glass laid across a checkerboard platform. On one side, there appeared to be a drop-off of a few inches. The other seemed to give way to a small chasm several feet below. Although perfectly safe, the juxtaposition of opacity and transparency created the impression of a precipice. This visual cliff staged the problem of affordance, although it was not yet named as such. Images of mothers beckoning infants to traverse the makeshift gorge entered popular culture through New York Times and Life features. They have been canonized in psychology textbooks for more than half a century. We are bringing babies back in order to think about what affordance affords. Eleanor and JJ met at women-only Smith College during the Great Depression. She was a student. He was an assistant professor. She completed her undergraduate and master's degrees in psychology before finishing a PhD at Yale in 1938. The Gibsons spent decades at Cornell University, where JJ kept a lab by the airport, but nepotism rules prohibited Eleanor from eligibility as a faculty hire. She worked as a contingent scholar with no lab of her own, nor license to apply for grants as a principal investigator. When JJ retired in 1970, Eleanor became the first developmental psychologist in the Department of Psychology, as well as Cornell University's first female endowed chair. She was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1977, and she received a National Medal of Science in 1992, which is the highest scientific honor in the United States. If mid-century psychologists were preoccupied with social attachments, stimulus responses, and mental associations, the Gibsons, together, developed a paradigm they called perceptual ecology, and the visual cliff was a crucial experimental foundation. By isolating the child from its mother, they established an ontogenetic basis for, quote, independent locomotion and discrimination of depth, untethered from the psychosexual dramas and ambivalent interiorities that riddled mid-century white middle-class patriarchy. As unnerving as they are exciting, photographs of babies on the brink raise the question, what does the infant see? In the experiment, almost every toddler refused to venture over the cliff. For Gibson and Walk, this not only proved the baby's perceptual fitness, but also established that mobile depth perception is a direct ecological endowment, not a matter of habits, associations, or institutions. And with this, I'm going to hand this off to Eric.
Next slide, please. Thank you. Cybernetics has long been narrated as the paradigm that shaped human-computer interaction, but perceptual ecology reveals another path, equally foundational but ontologically distinct. Perceptual ecology is not concerned with signals and feedback loops and uncertainty. Instead, it theorizes a sensory-rich, ever-changing world inhabited by animate perceivers. The terrain is a substance, the ground a surface primordially differentiated from the sky at the horizon. The atmosphere is an immersive, boundless medium. Animate perceivers do not receive bits of information through discrete channels. Instead, they register a constant flux of light on surfaces as an ambient optical array. Persistent sensory information is invariance, and it corresponds to the solid angles of a shifting world. Perceptual ecology, like other paradigms that shaped human-computer interaction, addressed the predicament of the soldier moving through the world in a machine. During World War II, Eleanor took leave from teaching and research to raise children, and JJ led a US Army Air Force's aviation psychology program unit called the Psychological Test Film Unit. The unit jettisoned the instrumentation of cockpits and radar screens to make films. The animated mobile point of view shots that we associate with first-person shooter games and virtual reality experiences were developed to train pilots and to build a psychological theory of being in the world that is perceptual and ecological at once. In 1947, JJ wrote that, quote, all spaces in which we can live include at least one surface, the ground, or terrain. If there were no surface, there would be no visual world, strictly speaking, end quote. The visual cliff, however, brought the surfaces and animate perceivers together in the lab in order to prove that discrimination is uniquely psychological rather than merely physiological. Babies of all kinds, humans, kittens, goats, rats, lambs, puppies, were placed on the apparatus to the same effect. Surfaces are meaningful in terms of an organism's proprioceptive sensory capacities within an ecological niche. Their perceptual thresholds act as optical footholds or levers for immediate responsive action or edge detection. Affordance names this frame of reference as organism-environmental relationality. Donald Norman's version of affordance channeled perceptual ecology into design. Norman explains, quote, affordances provide strong clues to the operation of things. Plates are for pushing, knobs are for turning. When affordances are taken advantage of, the user knows what to do just by looking. No picture, label, or instruction is required. Good design, he argued, leads to immediate understanding. Now, good here means ease, not crude or beautiful. Norman's natural design breaks with Beaux-Arts, Bauhaus, and arts and crafts traditions. This aesthetic of immediate understanding took hold through the language of user experience. In the moment when graphical conventions were being developed, affordance constrained interface functions and forms. It diffused through training programs, professional organizations, and publications. It circulated through engineering, social science, the arts and humanities, and in the process, terrestrial surfaces became digital media ecologies, and affordance became a term for technology writ large. Now, affordance seems capaciously relational, perhaps almost to the point of banality. At first glance, it reads as a popularized social science term, but upon critical reflection, one begins to perceive how affordance thinking contracts the view. When what you see is what you get, social difference, intermediaries, and ethical disturbances disappear from the schema of the given. If this politics often evaded its notice, perhaps it has something to do with how elegantly affordance nominalizes the verb to afford. By focusing on the complementarity of the animal and the environment, it omits political economy by design. To afford is to provision, to bear the expense of accomplishing something. The Gibsonian neologism replaces the political economic provocation, what is to be done, with the perceptual ecological question, what is immediately given. Now, direct experience is a rather narrow and ambivalent mode of ease. It relies upon mediations and hidden labors that must go unseen. A gender history that adds specific figures to the canon can never go far enough. There is trouble with a model that takes what is seen as the limit of what can be given. So if we are to reckon with affordance, we need to promote the concept to the status of a metaphysical reckoning with being in the world. Like I-thou relations, a phenomenology for Dasein, a biosemiotic Umwelt, Kantianism, or Cartesianism, there is a big move underway on the visual cliff. But there is also a sensational melodrama of eyeballs on the brink, which Norman's turn to emotional design brings to the surface. By querying and expanding the term, we could embrace perceptual ecology as political economy as design. We can openly declare that society is not condemned to forever teeter on the cliff, whether narrative, fiscal, or metaphysical, and there are many worlds that we can afford. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Erica and Scott. What a fantastic kickoff to the evening. Our second speaker is Vaz Milheiro, Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Lisbon and a researcher at the African Studies Centre at the University of Porto. Anna will be discussing gendered work in former Portuguese colonial Africa. And if you do have any questions, please remember to just pop them in the chat. Thank you, Anna.
Okay, thank you very much for having me here. So I will start immediately. So the question of women labourists in the public works in the former African territories under Portuguese rule was never addressed in the historiography linked to the Portuguese colonialism, following the same pattern of absence of studies on colonial mass labour in the former Portuguese, African and Asian colonies. The persistence of these values is a massive gap given the quantity of international literature, which has focused on the theme, mainly in the current countries which form part of the former British Empire. In this domain, the case of India is probably the most outstanding. For this presentation, I have chosen two international biographical bases in order to help frame the Portuguese case. The first is, of course, Thinking Otherwise, Theorizing the Colonial Modern Gender System in Africa by Boris Berthold, an article published 4 years ago, which ensures a theoretical framework exemplifying the advancement of post-colonial studies in terms of gender issues. And the second is a case study described by Madhahi Jha, referring precisely to a region in the former British India, article entitled Men Diggers and Women Carriers, Gender Work on Famine Public Works in Colonial North Africa, edited in 2020. In Gendered Work in Former Portuguese Colonial Africa, Mass Labor and Public Works, the title of my presentation, I will try to cross the theoretical aspects, or at least mention them, with historical aspects based on the few data we have been collecting in the Portuguese archives dedicated to the colonial past, which especially highlighting on the Arquivo Histórico Ultramarino, located in Lisbon, where most of the reference material comes from. Much of this documentation, it's original in terms of historiographical treatment. So I have divided this presentation in 3 flashes: women's labor in public works in Portuguese colonies in Africa, women's labor in European Portugal, and a specific case of Cabo Verde. The chronological framework goes from the 70s of the 19th century to the end of the 60s of the last century. The first slide, it sets in the geographical context of Angola during the Portuguese colonial period. The image cover almost a century of colonialization. They pair a document from the late 19th century, which compiles information for the period between the late 19th, and included a table of salaries for public works workers, with 2 images of African women making bricks out of adobes for their houses in Tag Regedoria in the late 60s. By establishing this temporal relationship between pictures, I want to draw attention to the fact that African women were involved in construction sites throughout the entire phase of the so-called Third Portuguese Empire, which correspond exactly to the modern colonization effort of the 5 African territories controlled by the Portuguese until 1975. So Cabo Verde, São Tomé e Príncipe, and also Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Mozambique. The second slide, I will not ask you to change yet, but the second slide is set in Portugal and frames the condition of Portuguese women living in the post-World War II, who found in construction sites a way of increasing their family income. These photographs taken in the 40s of the last century, where I will show you later, immediately after the war, they will show also construction sites in the north of Portugal. And the third and last slide, or set of slides, refers to a specific condition of the Cape Verdean woman in a territory cyclically ravaged by droughts and famines, with strong male immigration, where public works represents an important source of income for the domestic economy of the islands. The images that I will show were taken from the report of the Inspector António de Almeida, produced for the colonial administration in 1948. With these 3 sets of pictures, I hope to be able to outline a first and still described approach to the reality and studied by Portuguese historiography associated to the late colonial period, which is precisely the presence of women in the public works in Portugal and its colonies. I will also try to illustrate that this situation was transversal to the metropolitan colonial society and was certainly exclusive for the most unprotected and impoverished classes. If in Portugal, these contingents of women were associated with rural life, where poverty and illiteracy prevail among women, who were often also responsible for the family income, in Africa it was a condition that varied from colony to colony, being felt in both rural and urban areas. As I wrote in the abstract, this condition reflected 2 levels of subordination. On one hand, the racial question, which dictated the colonial division of labor, placed these women in a hierarchical inferior level to non-African workers. On the other, the gender question, which once again related these women to the bottom of the pyramid in terms of labor division. These women were treated in a double unequal manner. I chose return, so the first set of image, which deals with Angola, starting by recalling the question with which I began the abstract. How did the presence of women frame labor conflicts in construction sites and respond to the design of colonial infrastructure? The hypothetical research questions presuppose two assumptions. How did women frame themselves at the construction sites, and what eventual conflicts did they generate or pacify, and how did they fit in terms of technical aspects? The report shown in the first image refers to the 19th century document which sets the wages of women and miners in comparison with men. It is a document which precedes the first Portuguese regulation of women works, which would only take place in 1819. Later, still, within the scope of colonial public works, it was established that women could perform tasks that were not too physically demanding, with the exception of labor inside mines, those working underground in terms of mostly in teams with of mostly men workers who were completely forbidden. The pay scale in the image indicates that women were paid more or less 2/3 of the men's wages and were at the bottom of the table of wiring system along with miners. They would perform work associated with unskilled tasks. For example, they would be loaders of earth in the excavations or earth moving or as quarries of materials for construction. A curious fact is this table appears in a report that illustrates a wage increase, generalized, reflecting in the author's perspective a positive development and demanding weekly and regular payments in order to attract labor, as mentioned at the time, and probably also women to work in this construction site. Despite the mention of women, there are no information about their number, how women were recruited, and what functions they performed. It is probably, however, following Mahid's description for the Indian case, that they were recruited together with their husbands and perhaps even older children, thus forming groups of families that move simultaneously with the construction sites in the building of transport infrastructures, for example, such as roads or railways. In the more recent photographs on the left, a reality linked to late Portuguese colonialism is represented, which sought to involve women in programs for the acceptance of the colonial regime. This was the case of the so-called development program working together for a better Portugal, already in the middle of the liberation war in Angola, which began 6 years before these images were took. These photographs were mostly likely taken for propaganda purposes. The presence of African women consolidating a multi-continental country, as advocated by Portugal at the time, was essentially to agglutinate the colonial and metropolitan societies around the colonial project. Women were represented as being involved in the construction of their own dwellings, in a way recovering the traditional role of African women in ensuring the existence and conservation of the home, of their own houses. The second, so I asked for the second set, please. The second set of image reflects Portugal in the years immediately following the Second World War, and it was introduced in this presentation for comparative purposes. What conditions these Portuguese women live in this period after the war? A portrait of this woman was made by Maria Lamas in a book published in 1948. So it's in a book called Mulheres no Meu País, which showed poor working class women on different construction sites. These women belonged to the most economically vulnerable demographic groups, coming from rural areas, illiterate, and being the main caretakers of their own families. The main image, however, refers to a construction site in Ofir, in Esposende, region in the north of Portugal, a tourist resort designed by an architect, a well-known architect in Portuguese historiography, called Alfredo Magalhães, and consisting essentially on holidays homes for the Porto elite. These women came from the surrounding village and helping the men, probably husbands again, and their sons, in construction tasks, preparing mortar or transporting construction materials. They were most probably recruited as a family, seeing these jobs as a way to increase the family's meager income, thus being a seasonal and occasional work. They belong to the same cycle of poverty as the third group taken from Antonio de Almeida's report, that portrayed the reality of women in Cabo Verde. So then I can pass for the second and last slide, please. So in this report, which corresponds to the last image, is it so far one of the few documents of the colonial administration that emphasizes the condition of African women in public works, even including photograph reports, which is really, really rare in the Portuguese context. There are lots of photographs with men working, but not women. The report was published after the Great Droughts and famines of 1946, which left a trail of death in the islands. António de Almeida, the inspector who wrote it, had a connection with the archipelago, Cabo Verde, his father belonging to the local public services, and he was raised in the islands. So he was really very sensitive to the problems of the islands. He would choose consolidate an extremely paternalist view of this reality, placing Cabo Verdean women in a subordinate condition, not only in relation to the colonial system, but also in relation to the Cabo Verdean men. So as Paivac explained in her canonical texts or article, Can the Subaltern Speak?, Almeida saw it as an obligation of the white European men to protect Cape Verdean women from their fellow countrymen. For this reason, he criticized unequal pay and praised the woman's dedication to labor. As Almeida underlined in his report, as an alternative to the public works construction site, this woman has no choice but to prostitute themselves. So in Almeida's perspective, these tasks help Cabo Verde women to survive through honest work, all through, as he points out several times, poorly paid. Thus, returning to my abstract, to give voice to the subalterns engaged in architectural and urban practice is to bring the mass labor to the center of the debate. Most of them, including women and children, took part of different specialized groups according to recruitment classes and programs. Ports and railways, as I wrote, sanitary infrastructure and road constructions, military resettlement teams, building construction teams. In former Portuguese, the involvement of women in construction, in former Portuguese Africa, the involvement of women in the construction of infrastructures promoted by the colonial public works service dates back, as I show you, dates back to the turn of the 19th century, and reference to their existence can be found in payrolls where they were clearly subordinate to men works earning lower wages. It is now up to us to go a little further and understand if their presence generates conflicts, if it perpetuates their conditions of double subalternity, or if it eventually had an impact on architectural culture. So this is an exploratory paper that I would like to share with you. And I would say that it's just the beginning of a work that we are trying to start involving mass labor work or in mass labor work in colonial, in Portuguese colonial case. So thank you very much for listening to me and for the opportunity of being here. It was a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you so much, Anna, for sharing your really important research. I can't wait to hear more about it at the end in the discussion. Our next speaker is Kerry Meegan, who is Programme Chair of the BA in Visual Merchandising and Display at the Technological University in Dublin. Kerry is also a final year PhD student at the Modern Interior Centre at Kingston University, where her research focuses on what she will be discussing tonight, the history and the professionalisation of window display. So I will hand over to you now, Kerry.
Thank you, Alex. So this presentation considers the hidden history of the female protagonist, largely responsible for developing window display into professional practice, Elizabeth von Stephanie Hahn. The technique she developed in the 1900s and the 1910s were disseminated internationally and further refined in the 1920s to consider modern art movements. Born in Achheim, Germany in 1868, Stephanie Hahn was a graduate of the Karlsruhe Kunstakademie. She also studied painting in Paris. In 1904, she became the first full-time director of window display at the large A. Wertheim department store on the Leipziger Platz in Berlin. The renowned architect Alfred Messel designed the building without signage, seen here in the left-hand side of the slide. Messel's department store facade turned the run of the show windows into a new whole, thereby creating a new rank for display. To accomplish his vision, Messel commissioned several noted artists to design the windows. Most were unsuccessful, except for Stephanie Hahn, an artist of repute who took the lead as director of decoration, a role that in other countries was dominated by men. She was responsible for window display at the store for the following 20 years, and Stephanie Hahn repeatedly referred to Messel as the father of Schaufensterkunst, show window art. The work of Elisabeth von Stephanie Hahn was probably responsible for the Deutsche Werkbund's window reform. From 1909, the Werkbund and its female members, such as Stephanie Hahn and Elsa Oppler-Leibband, brought attention to the educational aesthetics of the applied arts and women's roles. Next slide, please. Prior to their reform, German display windows were usually installed by shop workers who filled them with products. In Britain, this was known as the massed method. However, other methods appeared towards the end of the 19th century, including realistic mise-en-scène settings of drawing rooms or outdoor scenes, and what was referred to as stunt or novelty displays. Guidelines for recreating these displays were available in international correspondence course textbooks. They were designed, made, and installed by burgeoning, primarily male, window display practitioners who felt they had to prove they could provide more than the overstocked displays of the salesperson. These display methods first appeared at world fairs. National and international visitors to the Chicago World Fair of 1893, impressed by what they saw, took home the techniques used to attract attendees. Stunt displays consisted of sculptural models of architectural or organic structures made from products such as handkerchiefs, as seen here in the top left example from America, and men's braces, as seen in the lower left image from Germany. The forms bore no relation to the use of the products from which they were made, and Stephanie Hahn disdained this practice and described it as, quote, from each material something else had to develop, unquote. Art historian Paul Vestheim was even more vitriolic. He discussed the improper use of products to create decorations such as, quote, warships made out of napkins and shirts, ornate arches made of sheets or handkerchiefs. And he continued, quote, the saleable item is raped and spoiled so that only a decorativeness can be shown. So disregarding previous display methods, Stephanie Hahn followed Messel's request that Wertheim's window displays be designed according to the laws of art. She believed the show window was a new art form, and rather than busy backgrounds or novelty structures, she advocated simple product arrangements, as seen in the two images on the right. And Stephanie Hahn argued the principles used in creating a piece of art by a sculptor or artist should be used in display, particularly the laws of spatial composition, color, line, and harmony, therefore allowing products to be displayed at their best. And these examples of Stephanie Hahn's work in 1910 used composition and balance, focusing on the product for sale. And she believed tasteful window displays enhanced the artistic awareness of the public. Next slide, please. So Stephanie Hahn created an entirely new style of display, and sketches of A. Wertheim window displays in Berlin featured in the internationally read American Journal on Window Display, Merchant's Record and Show Window in 1908. And the article declared that attention to detail, such as the considered placement of fans or gloves, was why, quote, Berlin windows are so artistic and attractive, unquote. Stephanie Hann also disseminated her skills through teaching. So the value of window display as an educator of taste for the masses began with the Deutsche Werkbund's window display reform in 1909. And Stephanie Hann's display style and the success of the Greater Berlin Show Window Contest of 1909 provided the Werkbund with the impetus to launch a training school in window display, the Haror Fachschule for Decoration Kunst in Berlin. And that translates as the Higher Technical School of Decoration. And that was launched in 1910. A colleague of Stephanie Hann's at Wertheim, Else Oppler-Legband, was commissioned to set up the school. And Oppler-Legband had studied under Henry van de Velde and Peter Behrens. The Fachschule was incorporated into the private Schulreimen in 1912. And upon Oppler-Legband's resignation, Stephanie Hann steered the Schulreimen display department through the 1910s. As a private school, the Reimen could quickly respond to trade and social changes. And as its reputation grew, several Berlin companies engaged graduates. In 1919, Stephanie Hann published a successful seminal textbook, seen in the center of the slide here, called Fenster Kunst, Show Window Art. And the book proved popular, with reprints in 1923 and 1926. And the Schulreimen recommended it as most eminently important to its pupils. Stephanie Hann's Wertheim protege, George Fisher, became the display tutor at the Reimen from 1924 until 1935. And building on Stephanie Hann's fine art display fundamentals, Fisher took the principles of constructivism, applying them to Stephanie Hann's simplified display techniques. Fisher's work became admired internationally, and students from the Schulreimen worked with Donald Desky and Frederick Kiesler at Saks Fifth Avenue in New York in 1927 and 1928. The British Association of Displaymen's journal, Display, promoted German methods from 1923, and the editor, Richard Harman, noted that German displays followed rules of art. This wasn't the case in Britain at the time. And Harman featured images from Stephanie Hann's Schaufensterkunst to press his point, referring to it as a fine book on window display. Display and another British journal, Commercial Art, extolled German display education over anything in Britain. In 1926, British practitioners were encouraged to look to Germany, quote, to keep in touch with all that is up to date, unquote. And the first two dedicated British schools of window display were launched in 1928. The Arundel Display School of Window Decoration and Goldsman School of Window Display, and they were both based on Reiman's pedagogy. The display tutor at the Arundel School was a Reiman graduate, Heinz Kiesewetter, and British display luminary Edward N. Goldsman, the founder of the Goldsman School of Window Display, admired both Stephanie Hann and Fisher. At the time of opening his school, Goldsman was the London representative for Stephanie Hann's book, Schaufensterkunst, as can be seen in the image on the right. And therefore, it was entirely probable that it was used as a teaching aid. Due to the rise of the Third Reich, the Schulreimen, a Jewish-owned school, moved to London and opened in 1937. A tutor, Elsie Tartarka, who moved the school from Berlin, described Stephanie Hann as the, quote, real pioneer of a form of window display whose aim was to create an appropriate frame for every different kind of good. Her displays were distinguished, not only for their surprising but always tasteful color effects and care for detail, but also for an original and lively manner of presenting the goods. These were the features in strong contrast to the monotony of and lack of taste shown in all former displays. So therefore, this presentation, I think, has shown the value of Elizabeth von Stephanie Hann's history, and her progressiveness impacted the development of international display. So thank you.
Thank you, Kerry. Our final speaker tonight is Erin Malone, Chair of the Interaction Design BFA program at the California College of the Arts. Erin's presentation tonight is on the missing women in the history of interaction design. Please do remember to pop any questions in the chat box, and we will open the floor to discussion following Erin's presentation. Over to you, Erin.
Thank you, Alex. So the impetus for this research came out of preparation for an interaction design history survey course that I started teaching in 2020. It became clear to me at the time that there were very few places that collect the stories of the many women who have created and moved this discipline forward, from the beginning of computing to the expansion into digital practices involving information architecture, visual UI design, and interaction design, often called under the umbrella of user experience design. The history of computing barely mentions women, and the history of interaction design in desktop and web software hasn't actually really been written, even while much of the information is disappearing as sites disappear and memories fade. Interaction design is a team practice, and generally women tend not to claim credit for their team's work. This slide is a poster that I'm in the process of creating as I'm doing my research and plotting the names of women across time and creating connections between professional organizations, agencies, corporate organizations, universities, and government organizations. And it's by no means readable here. In my presentation today, I'm going to share the contributions of a handful of women. These are highlights of people who've been overlooked as our history is being written. So if you would go to the next slide, please. The first two women that I'm going to talk about, I'm claiming in our history, even though they were doing the work, their work long before interaction design became a practice. So 20 years before information architecture for the World Wide Web was a known practice, an internet and information specialist named Elizabeth Feinler was doing information architecture for the internet. Feinler worked at the Stanford Research Institute for Douglas Engelbart from 1972 to 1989. And while those who study computer history know about Douglas Engelbart and his work at SRI, few have heard of Feinler. At SRI, she was the director of Network Information Systems Center, and she managed the Network Information Center for Arpanet and the Defense Data Network across the internet. She organized hundreds of pages of information into the first Arpanet resource handbook, and this was a complete directory of all available computers and resources across Arpanet. It included information about each connected university and government agency, as well as the type of computer, the projects they were working on, and the contact person for each information. This information was originally distributed in hard copy, over 80,000 documents a year. And then as internet and storage capabilities evolved, they moved the data online, and she created some software applications to help organize that. Up until that point, everyone had to come to the centralized NIC, host machine, or call them up to look for information. When Feinler took over leading the process, they were just starting to create and convert TCP/IP protocols. And more people were using the system and looking for information. She took a user-centered approach to the work, ensuring that anyone, regardless of their expertise or familiarity with computers, could find what they needed. She and her team of about 40 women were responsible for defining the current domain name system, .com, .gov, .org, and for assigning and then managing the host naming registrations for the internet. What we take for granted now with a who is lookup, where you can type that into a browser and find out who owns the domain name and where it's registered and what server it sits on, Feinler and her team organized and managed, mostly in analog form, that information in those early days. She called the NIC a prehistoric Google, and her work set the framework for the information organization and the architecture of basic wayfinding across the internet. After SRI, she went to work at NASA. The second person is Adele Goldberg. Most would classify Adele Goldberg as a computer scientist and programmer, and you would be right on that count. I include her here because she is generally unknown in the interaction design world, but her work moved the industry forward in a way that set the stage for there to be interaction designers working in computing. A lot has been written about the early days of Xerox PARC as a place of innovations. We hear stories about Alan Kay and the teams he worked with, including Larry Tesler, Dan Ingalls, John Warnock, and Chuck Geschke, among others. These stories still permeate Silicon Valley. Yet when you dig into the history, Adele Goldberg is barely mentioned. She was cherry-picked by Alan Kay in 1973 to come work with him because of her user-centered design work with kids. She co-authored with Kay the 1977 groundbreaking paper about the Dynabook, a portable computer concept for use in classrooms by kids for learning about programming and computers. And as their work progressed, Goldberg was the one who came up with the concept of design templates and who designed most of the experiments to test the UI concepts with kids and then iterate and test again. Today, we would consider that a typical user experience research iteration process, but this was years before this was a codified method in software design. Goldberg recalled in an oral history for the Computer History Museum that her responsibility was really at the user level. What are people going to do with the Dynabook? Many of the concepts they worked on together were the inspiration for the user interface, first seen in the Xerox Star and then later seen in the Apple Macintosh. This proto-GUI work laid the foundation for the desktop UI we know today, with overlapping windows, scroll bars, direct interaction with elements and objects, and custom fonts, making documents more accessible and readable. And the documentation for this, written by Goldberg in 1980, was written years before most people had any experience working with a computer, let alone designing for it. And it predates Apple's human interface guidelines by 3 years. Next slide, please. So speaking of Apple, I'd like to talk about Joy Mountford. With degrees in cognitive psychology and engineering psychology, Joy Mountford spent her early years working in aviation products. She worked on flight simulators, control systems, and helmet displays for pilots, and things for like the shuttle, the space shuttle. She worked at Honeywell. In 1986, she moved to Apple, where she led the Apple Human Interface Group. While she was there, she and her team were responsible for inventing QuickTime and all its latest flavors like QuickTime 3D and QuickTime VR, as well as setting the baseline for good interface design and interaction heuristics for Apple software. These rules and patterns and principles not only affected the software designed for Apple computers, but influenced how Windows software was designed and built and laid the foundation for much of what has come after these last 35 plus years in terms of interface design best practices. In a piece she wrote in 1998, she says, the Human Interface Group became quite respected and also successful at building prototype applications and software tools. She goes on to say they were frequently asked to help out client customers and to teach them what they knew about design, prototyping, and evaluation. One of their additional roles was to show developers how to gather user and customer needs and to design the look and feel of a product in an iterative fashion. The early makeup of her team in the Human Interface Group was about 70% women. Her long career has focused a lot on designing speculative ideas, often years before the technology is viable for consumers, and has resulted in over 30 design patents, the latest issued in 2021 for her work at Ford on autonomous cars. And the last two folks I'd like to talk about are Valerie Fenster and Sylvia Harris. In the early 80s, while Macintosh was being invented and AOL was still known as Q-Link, Valerie Fenster was investigating and writing white papers about the rise of e-commerce in online spaces and on services like Minitel, which was a French service, and CompuServe. At the same time, Sylvia Harris, a partner in the graphic design firm 212 Associates, and one of the few African Americans working in the field, was working on interface designs for video text, Prodigy, and designing products for Citibank. Harris is well known in the world of graphic design history, but is unheard of in interaction design. Around 1986, Fenster went to work for Citibank after hearing about a role from Harris, and they had been working together. The role at the bank began her career as an interaction designer and human factors engineer. Prior to their work together, ATMs were simple with few interactive capabilities, just green ASCII text on a black background. At Citibank, Fenster was responsible for leading the design and research of new machines that would be touchscreen and making sure they were usable by real people. The bank had its own usability lab with real ATM machines in the basement where they could prototype interactions and test new features and functionality. The lab could be set up like a living room or set up like a branch. I still haven't understood why it would be set up as a living room, but back then. Behind the scenes, they had all this video equipment and lots of cameras in order to get angles of people using the machines. When Fenster embarked on creating more robust interactions, allowing the bank to offer more services, she worked with Sylvia Harris, who brought her graphic design and wayfinding expertise. They started adding new bank products, different kinds of checking accounts, savings accounts, and they would work through creating the flows and wireframes and then build real prototypes for testing. In 1990, after the American Disabilities Act was passed, Fenster hired 212 again to work on Citi's first ADA compliant ATM. By this time, ATMs were touchscreen, but they had no hard buttons or braille in the casing. Their new design used an simplified UI for each function with large white on black icons, and the use of sound to cue users for changing or ending functions. Fenster remembers working on this and other ADA features for 2 years with Harris. Fenster worked for Citibank for several years as an employee, becoming ultimately the vice president of tools and prototyping before leaving to become a consultant running her own company. After working in banking, she moved on to work on medical applications and appliances. And while she holds 1 patent for the ATM work, she holds several for her work in the medical field. Harris left her partnership in the mid-90s and went on to work on civic design projects, including the information design for the 2000 census, for which she is best, some of that work of which she's best known for. Her later work focused on bringing user-centered design and research practices to public policy, and she passed away unexpectedly in 2011. So those are just a few of the highlights of the women I've been researching and writing about. I'm working on a book, and there are a whole lot more stories that I hope I can share with you all in the future. Thank you.